While waiting for the children to be picked up from daycare, a 7-year-old licked her popsicle and said, "This reminds me of the window game." I giggled. "What's the window game, sweetie?" "When we're bad, we have to stand outside and keep our hands on the window so Daddy can see we're not cheating. Last time was 2 hours. That's when I noticed her fingers were swollen at the joints and purple at the tips. Stand outside? Yeah, in our underwear. Lynn licked her popsicle again. It's not mean, though. Daddy says we're building superior tolerance. She sounded out the big word proudly. Shawn tugged her sleeve. Lynn, we're not supposed to. What? Miss Phoebe is like family. She sees us more than Mommy does. Lynn turned back to me. Shawn only lasted 20 minutes last week before his legs stopped working. He had to crawl to the door, but Daddy made him wait another hour. My stomach dropped. Lynn, when you say underwear, what do you mean? Just underwear. Sometimes socks if we've been really good. But clothes are cheating. She was beaming with pride. We do it at night so the neighbors don't get confused about our family training. She suddenly pulled off her shoe and sock. Look! My toes are getting stronger. 3 toes were deep purple-black. Where her pinky toe should be, there was a twisted nub of flesh. That one fell off after Christmas training, she explained casually. Shawn whispered, My feet don't feel anything anymore. I have to look at them to walk right. I moved closer, pretending to help Shawn with his popsicle wrapper while I took a closer look. How often do you do this training? Whenever we need correction. Or sometimes just to stay strong. Tuesday was bath night, so we had to sit in ice water. Shawn is up to 15 minutes, but he threw up this time. Lynn showed me her palms. Patches of discolored scar tissue covered both hands. This is from the ice bucket challenge. The real one, not the internet one. My hands were trembling as I straightened some books. Have you told anyone else about this? Lynn shook her head. It's our family secret. My teacher asked about my fingers once. She tried to make a fist but couldn't close it fully. But Daddy wrote a note saying I have a circulation condition. What about your mom? I asked. She tried the training once but only lasted 10 minutes outside. Daddy was so disappointed. Now she just watches and times us. Shawn spoke up. Sometimes she sneaks us towels after, but we can only use one. Otherwise, Daddy gets mad. Oh! Lynn bounced excitedly. Daddy's building something new in the garage. A real ice bath like athletes use. We're going to work up to an hour. Shawn already failed the practice round, she added. He stopped breathing and turned blue. The ambulance came, but this time Daddy told them it was asthma. Lynn, how long has your family been doing this training? Lynn counted on her damaged fingers. Since I was 5. So, 2 years? Shawn started last year when he turned 4. Babies don't need training. Last month was the worst, Shawn whispered. The freezer game. Lynn nodded enthusiastically. We have a big freezer in the basement. Daddy put a lock on the outside. Quick training, only 30 minutes. But it's colder than outside. I couldn't breathe good, Shawn said. The air hurt. She pulled out a small notebook from her backpack, pages wrinkled and worn. See? I keep track of my records. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting. Monday, 90 minutes outside, only cried once. Wednesday, ice bucket, 50 minutes new record. Daddy says if I fill this notebook, he'll get me a real trophy. I stood up, my legs shaking. Where's your dad now? Coming from work. He's probably stuck in traffic. He works at the university. He's so smart. That's why he knows how to make us evolved, Shawn added. We're his best experiment. We had another brother, Lynn mentioned casually, sucking on her popsicle. Our oldest brother, Tommy. But he went to live somewhere else. Why? I asked, though my stomach was already churning. He was weak. He tried to get Daddy into trouble. She paused. I stepped into the hallway and called 911, whispering urgently. I have 2 children at my daycare showing severe signs of abuse. Physical damage from cold exposure. I went back in and got them cups of hot chocolate from our kitchen. Shawn picked up his cup and didn't flinch. It's not hot, he said. I touched the cup. It was burning hot. He literally couldn't feel it. Shawn, put that down, I said quickly. Suddenly the door burst open. It was their father. Daddy! Lynn brightened. I was just telling Miss Phoebe about our training. His face went from red to white. What did you tell her? About how strong we're getting, and the window game, and— Shut up! He grabbed both kids roughly by their arms. Lynn winced. Shawn started crying. Mr. Sinclair? I said calmly, moving between him and the door. The children were just having some hot chocolate. Why don't you— Daddy, you're hurting me, Lynn whimpered. Her father's hand clamped over her mouth. We're done here. The police are already on their way, I said. He turned back to look at me. You called the police? His face twisted into something inhuman. He dropped the children and lunged at me. His shoulder caught me hard in the ribs and we both crashed into the bookshelf behind me. Books fell everywhere while Lynn screamed and Shawn just stood there frozen with his arms at his sides. I twisted sideways to get between him and the kids again. Police are coming, I yelled as loud as I could. He grabbed my wrist and squeezed until I felt the bones grinding together. I used my free hand to push his face away and his grip loosened enough for me to pull back. The desk chair was right there, so I grabbed it and shoved it between us while backing the kids toward the bathroom door. His face was purple and the veins in his neck looked ready to burst. He kicked the chair aside, but then we all heard it. Sirens. Getting closer fast. He stopped moving forward and his whole body went rigid. Someone started pounding on the door so hard the whole frame shook. Everything okay in there? It was my neighbor from the insurance office next door. Mr. Sinclair took a step back from us and his hands dropped to his sides. The door burst open and 2 police officers rushed in with their hands on their weapons. They immediately moved between Mr. Sinclair and us while one asked if anyone was hurt. Just a misunderstanding, Mr. Sinclair said quickly. I'm a researcher at the university and these are my children. He pulled out his wallet and showed them his university ID card. This is all being blown out of proportion. The officers weren't listening though. One stayed with him while the other checked on me and the kids. Lynn had tears running down her face and Shawn still hadn't moved or said anything. The paramedics showed up within minutes and went straight to the kids. We don't need help, Lynn told them. We're just doing our training. One of the paramedics, a woman with short gray hair, gently took Lynn's hand to examine it. Lynn winced when she touched the swollen joints. These fingers need medical attention, sweetie. The other paramedic was checking Shawn, who finally started responding to questions with tiny nods. Mr. Sinclair started talking faster. This is about cold adaptation and building resilience in young subjects. He used big words like thermoregulation and vasoconstriction. Elite athletes use these exact methods for performance enhancement. He waved his university ID around like it meant something. I have published papers on stress tolerance. Nobody was buying it. The officers had him sit on a chair while they took my statement. The paramedics said both kids needed immediate hospital evaluation. Lynn kept insisting they were fine and didn't need doctors. Daddy says doctors make us weak, she explained to the paramedic. They loaded both kids onto gurneys even though they could walk. I climbed into the ambulance with them despite my legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. Lynn reached out with her damaged fingers and held my hand. Her skin felt cold and rough like tree bark. Shawn just stared at the ambulance ceiling without blinking. I wanted to cry but held it together for them. At the emergency room, everything moved fast. Dr. Daphne Reiner took one look at Lynn's feet when they removed her shoes and immediately called for warming blankets. Get me pain medication and start documenting everything, she told the nurses. She spoke to the kids in this calm, gentle voice while examining them. I'm just going to take some pictures of your hands and feet, okay? Lynn nodded, but kept saying she didn't need help. Dr. Reiner carefully photographed every mark, every scar, every damaged finger and toe. She measured the areas of discoloration and made detailed notes. Shawn's feet were worse than I thought. The skin was white in patches with dark purple spots between his toes. Detective Gregory Barnett found me in the waiting room about an hour later. He was tall with gray hair and tired eyes. I need you to tell me everything from the beginning, he said with his notebook ready. I started with Lynn telling me about the window game. His pen moved fast across the pages as I described the ice buckets and standing outside in underwear. When I got to the basement freezer with the lock on the outside, he stopped writing and looked up at me. They lock them in a freezer? I nodded and told him about Shawn turning blue and the ambulance thinking it was asthma. He wrote faster when I described Lynn's missing toe and Shawn not feeling the hot chocolate burning his hands. How long has this been happening? He asked. I told him what Lynn said about 2 years for her and 1 year for Shawn. His notebook was almost full by the time I finished. Marlena Pearson from CPS showed up while we were still talking. She had this kind but firm way about her that made me trust her immediately. I'm placing an emergency hold on both children, she said. They cannot go home tonight or any night until we complete our investigation. Relief washed over me so hard I almost collapsed. The kids were safe. They wouldn't have to stand outside tonight or sit in ice water or get locked in that freezer. What happens now? I asked her. She explained they would find emergency placement while the investigation continued. The children would get medical treatment and therapy. There would be court hearings and evaluations. It would be a long process, but the immediate danger was over. Detective Barnett walked me down to the police station that same night to get my official statement recorded. The interview room had gray walls and a small table with a recording device in the middle. He pressed the red button and asked me to start from the beginning with everything Lynn told me about the window game. My voice cracked when I described her missing toe and how she said it fell off after Christmas training. The detective had to pause the recording while I grabbed some tissues from the box on the table. We started again, and I told him about the ice buckets, and Shawn not feeling the hot chocolate burning his hands. He paused the recording a second time when I couldn't stop shaking while describing the basement freezer with the lock on the outside. The whole statement took almost 2 hours to get through because I kept remembering new details like Lynn's notebook and her pride about lasting 90 minutes outside. While I was still at the station, Dr. Reiner called Detective Barnett's cell phone about the kids' medical exam results. I could hear parts of her voice through the phone as she explained both children had extensive scarring from repeated frostbite exposure across their hands and feet. She said Shawn's nerve damage in both feet might be permanent based on the preliminary tests they ran. Detective Barnett put her on speaker so I could hear her describe the tissue death in Lynn's remaining toes and the patches of dead skin on both kids' palms. The doctor said she'd documented everything with photographs and would send the full medical report within 24 hours for the case file. After the call ended, Detective Barnett looked at me with this grim expression and said the detail about the locked freezer was enough for an immediate search warrant. He promised they'd check the Sinclair house tonight and find whatever else might be hidden in that basement or garage. 2 other detectives were already preparing the paperwork while we talked, and a search team would head out within the hour. I drove home around midnight with all my car doors locked and kept checking the rearview mirror for anyone following me. My apartment felt different when I walked in, like the walls were too thin and the locks too flimsy. I pushed my couch against the front door and checked every window twice to make sure they were all locked tight. That night I couldn't sleep at all and jumped at every noise from the hallway or street outside. My neighbor's cat knocked over something on their balcony, and I nearly called 911 before realizing what it was. I kept thinking about what other signs I might have missed over the past months with Lynn and Shawn. Had there been times they wore long sleeves in summer that I didn't question? Were there days they moved stiffly that I thought was just kids being tired? The guilt ate at me while I stared at the ceiling waiting for morning to come. Around 6 in the morning, my phone rang, and it was Marlena Pearson calling to say she'd found an emergency foster placement for the kids. The foster mom's name was Bernadette Adams, and she was experienced with trauma cases from her 20 years doing this work. Marlena said Bernadette lived on the other side of town, far from the Sinclair house, which would help the kids feel safer. She explained that Bernadette had a calm way about her, and never pushed traumatized kids to talk before they were ready. The placement paperwork was already being processed, and the kids would move there as soon as the hospital released them. Later that morning, Detective Barnett called and asked me to come back to the station because he had something to show me. When I got there, he pulled out an evidence bag with Lynn's notebook inside, the same one she'd shown me with her training records. He opened it to a page where her shaky handwriting said, "Wednesday ice bucket 50 minutes new record," with little stars drawn around it. My stomach turned and I had to sit down in the nearest chair while he flipped through more pages. There were entries going back months with times and temperatures and how many minutes she cried during each session. Some pages had smiley faces when she beat her previous records, and frowny faces when she couldn't last as long. Detective Barnett told me the search team had found the basement freezer exactly as the kids described it, with the exterior lock still attached. There was a timing chart taped to the wall next to it with columns for each child's name and dates going back over a year. The worst part was the child height handprints frozen on the inside walls where they'd pressed their palms trying to get out. Everyone on the search team went silent when they saw those small handprints preserved in the frost. They also found the ice bath Mr. Sinclair was building in the garage, along with receipts for industrial cooling equipment he'd ordered online. Later that day, Mrs. Sinclair was brought in for questioning and told police it was just resilience training that got out of hand. She claimed she saw similar things on social media about making kids tougher and thought her husband knew what he was doing since he worked at the university. She admitted she only tried the cold training once herself and couldn't handle more than 10 minutes before giving up. The detective said she cried during the interview, but also kept defending her husband's intelligence and saying he meant well. Stephen Dubois, the assistant district attorney, took over the case personally that afternoon because of how severe the abuse was. He met with me briefly to introduce himself and explain they were considering multiple felony charges, including child endangerment and torture. He said cases this extreme were rare, but the physical evidence was overwhelming with the medical reports and photographs. He warned me the defense would probably try to claim it was alternative parenting or some wellness trend gone wrong. The next day, Rosalind English got appointed as the children's legal guardian to represent their interests during all the legal proceedings. She met them at the hospital where they were still being treated for their injuries and psychological evaluation. When I saw her later, she seemed soft-spoken, but I could see steel underneath when she promised to protect Lynn and Shawn no matter what. She said her job was making sure the kids' needs came first, not what was easier for the adults or the system. Marlena came by the hospital the next morning with her clipboard and started writing down everything she saw on Lynn's hands and feet. She took photos of each purple finger and measured the dead patches of skin with a ruler, while Lynn sat there swinging her legs. Lynn kept telling her about all the records she'd broken and how Daddy said she was the strongest 7-year-old he knew. Marlena wrote that down too, how Lynn still thought the torture was something to be proud of. She tested Shawn's feet by touching them with different things like a pen and a cold water bottle and a warm cloth. He couldn't feel any of it and just stared at his feet like they belonged to someone else. Marlena documented that Shawn had zero feeling from his ankles down and would need special shoes and daily foot checks for the rest of his life. 2 days later, we all went to the courthouse for the bail hearing, and Mr. Sinclair's lawyer stood up wearing an expensive suit. He told the judge this was all a big misunderstanding about wellness trends he'd seen on social media, and that Mr. Sinclair was just trying to make his kids stronger, like those people who do cold plunges. The lawyer pulled out articles about ice baths and cold therapy, and said my report was exaggerated by someone who didn't understand alternative parenting methods. The judge listened to everything and then set bail at $100,000 and ordered Mr. Sinclair to have zero contact with the children or with me. Mr. Sinclair's face turned red when the judge said that, but his lawyer grabbed his arm to keep him quiet. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, and Mr. Sinclair stopped to talk to them even though his lawyer tried to pull him away. He said he was a victim of hysteria and that people didn't understand his research into making children more resilient. 3 of his colleagues from the university stood behind him, and one of them told the reporters that Mr. Sinclair was a brilliant researcher being persecuted for thinking differently. The university sent out a statement that afternoon saying they were putting him on administrative leave while they investigated, but Mr. Sinclair posted online that this was discrimination against innovative parenting. That night when I got home, there was a voicemail on my phone from a blocked number. The voice was muffled, but it said I should mind my own business and think about my future if I knew what was good for me. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold the phone to call Detective Barnett and forward him the recording. He said they'd try to trace it, but blocked numbers were hard to track and to call him right away if anything else happened. Dr. Reiner sent her official medical report to the court 3 days later, and it was worse than we thought. She confirmed Lynn had stage 3 frostbite damage that had killed tissue in multiple fingers and toes, and that some of the damage was old enough to show repeated exposure over years. For Shawn, she wrote that he had permanent peripheral neuropathy in both feet and lower legs that would never fully heal. She said both kids would need months of physical therapy and special medical care, and even then they might never get back full use of their hands and feet. The report included photos that made my stomach turn, close-ups of the dead tissue and nerve damage that no child should ever have. Rosalind went to see Lynn at the foster home and sat down with her in the living room with some juice boxes. She used really simple words to explain that Lynn couldn't go home right now, because the grown-ups needed to make sure she was safe. Lynn pulled out her notebook and showed Rosalind all her training records, pointing to each entry where she'd beaten her previous time. She kept saying if she could just show Daddy how much she'd improved, he'd let her come home and they could keep training together. Rosalind had to explain 3 different times that the training was actually hurting her body, but Lynn kept arguing that hurt was just weakness leaving the body like Daddy always said. Meanwhile, the detectives went back to search the Sinclair house again and found something in the garage that made everything worse. There was a big whiteboard labeled tolerance goals, with 3 columns for Lynn, Shawn, and Tommy. Under each name were dates and times showing how long each kid was supposed to last in different conditions. The times got longer and longer as the dates got more recent, and there were red marks next to times when the kids didn't meet their goals. Detective Barnett took photos of everything and matched the dates to Lynn's notebook entries, which lined up perfectly. The neighbor who lived behind the Sinclairs had originally agreed to testify about seeing the kids outside in their underwear during winter. She'd even given a statement about how she thought about calling someone but figured it wasn't her business. But then she called Detective Barnett and said she couldn't testify anymore because she was scared of what might happen. She said Mr. Sinclair had connections at the university, and she didn't want problems for her family. The detective tried to convince her, but she hung up and wouldn't answer when he called back. Then the investigation found something at the local hospital that should have been caught months ago. Shawn had been brought to the emergency room 3 months earlier with what Mr. Sinclair said was an asthma attack. But when they pulled the records, all the symptoms matched hypothermia, not asthma. His body temperature had been dangerously low, and he'd been confused and having trouble breathing. The doctor who treated him never reported it to anyone and just accepted Mr. Sinclair's explanation about asthma and sent them home with an inhaler. The next day, my boss at the daycare called me into her office and closed the door. She said reporters had been calling about the case and that I needed to avoid talking to any media for liability reasons. She said the daycare could get sued if I said the wrong thing, and that I should let the lawyers handle everything. I wanted to scream that the kids needed someone to speak up for them, but she said if I talked to reporters, I could lose my job. I left her office feeling trapped and alone, wanting to help Lynn and Shawn but being told to stay quiet and let the system handle it. 2 days later, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw an article shared by one of my old college friends with the headline, "Government Overreach: How One Daycare Worker Destroyed a Family." My face went hot as I clicked the link and found my name right there in the second paragraph, calling me an overzealous busybody who misunderstood a professor's innovative parenting methods. The article had over 3,000 shares already, and the comments were split between people defending Mr. Sinclair's right to raise resilient children and others calling him a monster. I screenshot everything and sent it to Detective Barnett, who told me to stay off social media for my own mental health, but I couldn't stop checking every few hours. Meanwhile, Marlena was putting together her report, and she called me that afternoon with more details about Mrs. Sinclair's involvement. She'd interviewed the mother separately and learned that Mrs. Sinclair would sometimes try to sneak towels to the kids after the ice training, but Mr. Sinclair had a 1-towel rule, and if she gave them more, he'd make the next session longer. Marlena said this showed Mrs. Sinclair knew what they were doing was wrong, but she was too scared or weak to actually stop it, which made her complicit in the abuse. The next morning, Rosalind texted me that she was taking Shawn to his first physical therapy appointment and asked if I wanted to come for support. I met them at the clinic where the therapist taught Shawn to check his feet every few steps, since he couldn't feel if he stepped on something sharp or if his shoes were too tight. He had to look down at his feet constantly while walking, counting each step out loud to make sure he was placing them right. The therapist put colored tape on the floor, and Shawn had to watch his feet to stay on the path, and when he tried to look up and walk by memory, he immediately stepped off the tape. It broke my heart watching this 5-year-old have to relearn something as basic as walking, because his father had destroyed the nerves in his feet. That same week, Detective Barnett called with news that made everything worse. They'd done a full search of Mr. Sinclair's university computer and found a deleted grant proposal titled Induced Stress Tolerance in Pediatric Subjects, where he was actually planning to publish research based on what he'd done to his own kids. The proposal talked about building superior humans through controlled exposure therapy starting in early childhood, and he'd been documenting everything with photos and measurements. He'd even included preliminary data from his test subjects, who were obviously Lynn and Shawn, though he didn't use their names. 3 days after that article came out, I got home to find a thick envelope from a law firm in my mailbox. My hands shook as I opened the cease and desist letter claiming I was spreading false information about Mr. Sinclair and damaging his reputation. The letter threatened legal action if I continued to make public statements about the case and listed specific social media posts I'd made. I called Detective Barnett immediately and he told me it was just intimidation tactics, that Mr. Sinclair's lawyer was trying to scare me into silence. He said to save the letter for evidence but not to worry about it since I hadn't done anything wrong. The next big development came when Rosalind got a voicemail from someone claiming to be Tommy Sinclair. The voice was young, maybe 13 or 14, and he said he'd run away 2 years ago after trying to report what his dad was doing. He'd been living in youth shelters and moving around, but he'd seen the news about his siblings and wanted to help them if he could. Rosalind played the message for Detective Barnett, who ran a trace, and found the call came from a payphone 2 towns over. She drove out there the next day and spent hours checking shelters until she found him at a place called Safe Harbor, using the fake name Tom Sanders. When she showed him photos of Lynn and Shawn, he started crying and agreed to meet with her properly, but he kept looking over his shoulder and flinching whenever someone walked past. At a quiet coffee shop, Tommy rolled up his sleeves and showed Rosalind his hands, which were covered in thick scar tissue. He told her the freezer punishment started when he was 6, just 30 minutes at first, but it got longer every time. By the time he was 11, he was doing 90 minutes, and his dad was talking about working up to 2 hours. He said the worst part wasn't even the cold, but how his dad would stand outside taking notes and checking his watch while Tommy screamed and pounded on the door. He ran away after his dad locked him in for 2 hours and he passed out, waking up in the hospital where his dad told doctors it was an accident with the freezer door getting stuck. While all this was happening, Mr. Sinclair went on some podcast called Parenting Without Fear and spent 45 minutes describing himself as a pioneer in childhood development, being persecuted by the nanny state. He used all this academic language about hormesis and adaptive stress response to make torturing kids sound like cutting-edge science. The host just nodded along and asked softball questions while Mr. Sinclair explained how modern children were weak because parents were too soft. The podcast got hundreds of thousands of downloads, and suddenly Mr. Sinclair had supporters sending him money for his legal defense. Stephen Dubois wasn't having any of it, though, and brought in 3 medical experts to review the kids' injuries and write reports for the case. They all said the same thing, that Mr. Sinclair's methods could have easily killed the children since kids can't regulate their body temperature like adults. One doctor wrote that making a child stand outside in winter for 2 hours was attempted murder, not training, and that the nerve damage to Shawn's feet was probably permanent. 3 weeks later, I was closing up the daycare when I saw Mr. Sinclair's car parked across the street. My hands started shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I told the dispatcher about the protective order and watched him sitting there in his silver sedan. He saw me looking and started his engine, driving away before the police cruiser turned the corner. The officer took my statement and said they'd add it to the file as a possible violation. The next morning, Marlena called me and sounded tired. She said her supervisor was asking hard questions about the case. The university had lawyers and Mr. Sinclair had connections all over town. Her boss wanted to know if they should really be using so many resources on this. Marlena fought back and told him about Lynn's missing toe and Shawn's dead nerves. But I could hear in her voice that the system was wearing her down. That afternoon, I typed out a long post about everything that was happening. My cursor hovered over the submit button for 10 minutes. Then I deleted it all and called Rosalind instead. She listened to me vent for 20 minutes before reminding me that staying quiet protected the legal case. Going public now could give the defense ammunition to use against us. It felt wrong to stay silent, but I knew she was right. 2 days later, Stephen Dubois showed me a leaked memo from the university. Someone had sent it to him anonymously. The memo showed that administrators knew about Mr. Sinclair's theories from faculty meetings. He'd presented his ideas about building tolerance in children through cold exposure. The university was now scrambling to distance themselves from him. They released a statement saying they never approved any research involving children. But the memo proved they knew what he believed and did nothing. Meanwhile, Rosalind was spending hours with Lynn at the foster home. She brought dolls and toys to help Lynn practice for her forensic interview. Lynn kept calling everything training, and Rosalind had to teach her new words. She showed Lynn it was okay to tell the truth even if Daddy got in trouble. Lynn would nod, but then slip back into calling it their special family exercises. The forensic interview happened at a special center with cameras and trained interviewers. I wasn't allowed in, but Rosalind told me about it later. Lynn had started strong, telling them about standing outside in her underwear. Then she mentioned something new that made everyone in the observation room go quiet. She said Mommy would cry while holding the stopwatch. Her mom would wipe her eyes and tell them to be strong for Daddy. This detail proved Mrs. Sinclair knew it was torture, but did it anyway. Stephen Dubois called me that week to prepare me for what was coming. He said the defense attorney would try to destroy my credibility on the stand. They'd paint me as an emotional caregiver who misunderstood cultural differences. He helped me practice staying calm and sticking to facts. We went over my statement again and again until I could tell it without crying. During all this, Shawn was going to physical therapy 3 times a week. The therapist worked with him on feeling pressure even if he couldn't feel temperature. One afternoon, Bernadette called Rosalind crying happy tears. Shawn had managed 2 full steps while watching his feet in the mirror. His face lit up with the biggest smile anyone had seen from him. It was a tiny victory, but it meant his body was learning to work around the damage. Tommy had been meeting with Rosalind regularly and brought something important to their last meeting. He pulled out an old phone with a cracked screen and showed her photos he'd taken secretly. One photo showed the basement freezer from the inside. You could see frost patterns on the walls that looked like small handprints. Another showed scratch marks on the inside of the door. Tommy said he took them after he got locked in for 2 hours. He thought he was going to die and wanted evidence if they found his body. The photos became crucial evidence of the torture chamber Mr. Sinclair had created. Then came the legal maneuvering that made everyone nervous. The defense attorney filed a motion to suppress all the evidence from the house search. He argued there was a problem with the warrant timing. The detective had started the search 15 minutes before the warrant was officially signed. It was a small technical error, but it could destroy the whole case. Stephen Dubois filed a response saying the error was harmless and the evidence was too important to exclude. We all held our breath waiting for the judge to decide. The hearing was set for the following week, and Stephen warned us it could go either way. If the judge threw out the house evidence, we'd lose the freezer, the timing charts, and Lynn's notebook. The case would rest mainly on the kids' testimony and their injuries. Stephen worked late every night preparing arguments about why the evidence should stay. He found cases where similar timing errors were forgiven because children were in danger. Meanwhile, Mr. Sinclair kept showing up places he shouldn't be. Parents at the daycare reported seeing him at the grocery store watching them. He never approached anyone, but his presence was meant to intimidate. Each sighting got reported, but he always left before police arrived. The pressure was building on everyone involved in the case. The hearing about the evidence happened 3 days later at the courthouse downtown. I sat in the back row watching Stephen Dubois argue with the defense attorney about whether the search was legal or not. The judge kept looking at photos of Lynn's blackened toes and Shawn's purple fingers while they argued about timing and signatures. After an hour of back and forth, the judge said most of the evidence could stay, but some things Mrs. Sinclair said to police couldn't be used because they might have pressured her. Stephen told me afterward it wasn't perfect, but we had enough to keep going. 2 weeks passed before the preliminary hearing where they'd decide if there was enough evidence for a real trial. Dr. Reiner took the stand first and explained all the medical stuff about frostbite and nerve damage in simple terms even I could understand. She showed charts of normal tissue versus what she found on Lynn and Shawn. The defense attorney tried suggesting maybe the kids had some rare disease or played outside too long by accident. Dr. Reiner shut that down fast by explaining how the injury patterns matched repeated controlled exposure, not random accidents or medical conditions. She pointed to specific scarring that only happens from multiple freezing events over time. When my turn came to testify, my hands were shaking, so bad I had to hold them in my lap. The defense attorney kept asking if maybe I misunderstood what the kids said, or if I asked leading questions. I stuck to exactly what happened that day, repeating Lynn's exact words about the window game and the freezer. He tried to make it sound like I coached them, but I just kept saying what they told me. The prosecutor had me read from my notes I wrote right after calling 911. Tommy's testimony happened in a closed session, which meant I couldn't watch, but Rosalind told me about it later. He described years of getting worse and worse punishment starting when he was 6. He showed the judge his own scars and talked about trying to tell a teacher once, but his dad found out and locked him in the freezer for 3 hours. His testimony matched everything Lynn had said, plus added details about earlier years before she was old enough to remember. The judge took a week to decide, but finally ruled there was enough evidence for a full trial. Because of Mr. Sinclair showing up at my daycare, the judge made his bail conditions stricter. He had to wear an ankle monitor and couldn't go within 500 feet of any school or daycare. His lawyer complained, but the judge said protecting children came first. Around this same time, Marlena from CPS met with Mrs. Sinclair about possibly getting the kids back if she divorced her husband and did intensive therapy. Mrs. Sinclair said she needed time to think about it, which made everyone frustrated. Rosalind called me that night upset because any decent mother would jump at the chance to get her kids back safely. Marlena said this happens sometimes when the spouse has been controlling for so long. Meanwhile, Bernadette called Rosalind with good news about how the kids were doing in foster care. They were sleeping through most nights now without nightmares. She never punished them for wetting the bed or crying, just changed the sheets and gave them hugs. Lynn was starting to play with toys like a normal kid instead of always talking about training. Shawn was making friends with Bernadette's dog, who seemed to know he needed gentle attention. The university finally made their move after their ethics board spent weeks investigating. They fired Mr. Sinclair completely and banned him from campus. His research got pulled from their databases and his name removed from published papers. Some professors who defended him earlier went quiet when they saw the evidence. His whole academic career was destroyed in one board meeting. Stephen called me when the defense attorney contacted him with a plea deal offer. They wanted Mr. Sinclair to plead to lesser charges that would mean probation and counseling, but no prison time. Stephen asked what I thought and whether Rosalind and the team should consider it. I told him those kids deserved better than their dad walking free after what he did. Stephen said he agreed but wanted everyone's input before responding. The therapy sessions with Lynn were hard to hear about. The therapist told Rosalind that Lynn kept talking about missing making her daddy proud. She'd start crying when she remembered Shawn turning blue in the freezer, but then get confused about whether that was bad or just part of getting stronger. The therapist said this confusion was totally normal for kids who've been abused by someone they love. It would take months or years for Lynn to understand what happened wasn't her fault. 3 weeks passed before Rosalind called me with news about Mrs. Sinclair wanting to meet privately. She'd been staying at her sister's house since the arrest, and finally worked up the courage to talk. Rosalind met her at a coffee shop downtown, where Mrs. Sinclair sat in the back corner wearing sunglasses even though it was cloudy. Her hands shook as she held her coffee cup, and she kept looking over her shoulder every few minutes. She told Rosalind she'd been scared of her husband for years but didn't know how to leave safely. He controlled all their money and knew people at the university who could make her life hard. She admitted watching the kids during the training made her sick, but she was too scared to stop it. When Rosalind asked if she'd testify against him, Mrs. Sinclair nodded and started crying. She said she wanted to help the kids and would do whatever the prosecution needed. Rosalind got her connected with a victim advocate who helped her file for a protective order and set up a safety plan. Stephen called me the next day about the plea deal offer from Mr. Sinclair's lawyer. They wanted him to plead guilty to simple child endangerment and get probation with counseling instead of prison time. Stephen's voice got hard when he told me he wasn't taking that deal. He sent back a counteroffer demanding at least 5 years in prison, lifetime no contact orders with the kids, and Mr. Sinclair had to admit everything he did in court. The defense lawyer laughed at first, but Stephen wouldn't budge. He told them this wasn't a misunderstanding or accident, but systematic torture of children. The defense team started filing paperwork to delay everything they could. They asked for more time to review evidence, then more time to find expert witnesses, then more time for psychiatric evaluations. Every hearing got pushed back by weeks, and Marlena warned us this was normal strategy for cases like this. They were hoping witnesses would get tired or scared and back out if they dragged it on long enough. The judge saw through some of it, but had to grant reasonable requests for preparation time. Meanwhile, the family court made decisions about the kids' immediate future. They approved Bernadette as the long-term foster placement since the kids were doing well with her. The judge also started supervised visits between Mrs. Sinclair and the children at the CPS office. The first visit happened on a Tuesday afternoon with a social worker watching everything. Mrs. Sinclair cried when she saw Lynn's fingers and Shawn's careful way of walking. She hugged them gently and followed every rule the social worker gave her about appropriate topics. Lynn asked when she could come home, and Mrs. Sinclair had to explain things were different now. The visits happened every week for an hour, and slowly the kids started to relax around their mom again. I decided to step back from direct contact with the kids after talking to Rosalind about boundaries. She said it was important for them to bond with their foster family without confusion about my role. I sent them a simple card with a picture of a rainbow that just said I was thinking about them and hoped they were happy. Bernadette told me later that Lynn kept the card on her nightstand and looked at it every night before bed. The physical therapy sessions for Shawn were showing small improvements each week. The therapist worked on helping him relearn how to feel his balance without relying on foot sensation. They used special exercises with mirrors so he could see his feet while practicing walking. One Thursday afternoon, he managed to take 2 full steps without looking down at his feet. Everyone in the therapy room started clapping, and Shawn's face lit up with the biggest smile. The therapist said his body was learning to use other signals to compensate for the nerve damage. It would take months or maybe years, but there was real hope for improvement. Lynn had started art therapy as part of her treatment, and one day she drew something that made everyone stop. It was a picture of a window with pretty yellow curtains and flowers on the windowsill. At the bottom, she wrote in careful letters that she didn't have to stand outside anymore. Bernadette asked if she could frame it, and Lynn nodded shyly. They hung it in Lynn's new bedroom, right where she could see it from her bed. The therapist said it showed Lynn was starting to understand the difference between her old life and her new safe one. 6 months had gone by since that day at my daycare when everything changed. I still found myself checking my door locks twice before bed and keeping my porch light on all night. Sometimes I'd wake up thinking I heard Mr. Sinclair's angry voice, but it was just a nightmare. The trial date kept getting pushed back, but Stephen said they had a strong case whenever it happened. The kids were getting real help with doctors and therapists who understood trauma. Lynn and Shawn were learning what normal childhood felt like with Bernadette's patient care. Whatever happened with the trial, those kids were free from that basement freezer and the window game and all the other torture their father called training. Well, folks, that's gonna wrap it up for today. Hope you had fun just wondering about stuff with me for a bit. Until we cross paths again, if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.